In the autumn of 1957, when state officials finally unsealed the waterlogged cellars of the Convent of Perpetual Solace, they were not looking for evidence of a crime. They were assessing flood damage. What they found instead would reveal that for 34 years, this place of supposed sanctuary had harvested something other than prayer, and that the hearts of 73 young women had never left. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to hear stories that others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what really happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. The geography of fear is a map we draw together. Our story takes root in Port Fathom, Oregon. Even in the early 20th century, it was a place that felt ancient, a town perpetually wrapped in a damp, gray shroud of sea mist. The air carried the constant scent of salt, wet pine, and the deep, cold brine of the Pacific. It was a town of fishermen, of loggers, of quiet, hard-working people who kept to themselves and held a deep, inherited respect for God and the unforgiving ocean that gave and took in equal measure. High on the cliffs overlooking the town, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky, stood the Convent of Perpetual Solace. It was not a welcoming place. Built from dark, locally quarried stone that seemed to drink the light, its Gothic architecture spoke of discipline, of severity, of a separation from the world below. For decades, it was a landmark and a mystery. The people of Port Fathom knew it as a place where troubled girls were sent, daughters of wealthy families from Portland, Seattle, even as far as San Francisco, girls who were too rebellious, too melancholic, too inclined to scandal. The convent had a reputation for success under its nature of the deception / cover, a rigorous program of religious sanctuary offering spiritual purification. These difficult young women were transformed. They would enter the convent for a period of 1 to 2 years, and when they emerged, if they emerged at all, they were models of placid obedience. More often, families were simply informed via a terse, eloquent letter that their daughter had found a true calling and had taken vows to spend her life in cloistered service, severing all worldly ties. In an era that prized conformity above all else, most families accepted this explanation with a sense of relief, gratitude, and a quiet, unexamined shame. They paid the exorbitant donations, asked no further questions, and were glad to have the problem solved. The convent, in essence, was a place where inconvenient daughters disappeared. This was the world that made the convent possible. A world of strict social mores, of unquestioning faith in religious institutions, and a world where the private affairs of the wealthy were considered just that, private. The iron gates of Perpetual Solace were a border between the known world and a place of absolute authority. No one from the town went in, and for 34 years the secrets of what happened within its walls were kept as perfectly as the silent vows of its inhabitants. The architect of this silent kingdom was Mother Superior Eleanor Fairfax. She was not a native of Oregon. She arrived in 1923 with a small fortune of unknown origin and a charter from an obscure ecclesiastical order to establish the convent. Photographs from the era show a woman carved from ice, tall, austere, with intelligent, unblinking eyes that seemed to look straight through a person, assessing every flaw, every weakness. She was not a woman of simple faith. She was a theologian of terrifying intellect and conviction. The perpetrator family name, Fairfax, would become synonymous with a uniquely insidious form of evil. Eleanor Fairfax preached what came to be known within the convent's walls as the Fairfax Doctrine. It was a twisted, heretical fusion of medieval mysticism and early 20th century pathology. She taught that sin was not an abstract spiritual failing, but a literal physical disease, a rot that took root in the flesh of the human heart. Pride, vanity, despair, lust, defiance. These were not mere temptations. To Mother Superior Fairfax, they were tumors of the soul, malignancies that had to be physically, surgically excised for salvation to be possible. She was not alone in her work. Her chief instrument was Sister Agnes, a woman whose history was deliberately erased. She was listed in convent records only as the infirmarian, but her true role was that of a convent physician and surgeon. Whispers from the few lay workers who cleaned the convent's outer halls spoke of Sister Agnes's unnerving calm, her hands that were as steady as a rock, and her private workshop that smelled constantly of carbolic acid and something else, something sweet and metallic. She was the one who would perform the purification. The third point in this unholy trinity was Father Michael Crowe, a disgraced priest from Boston. He found refuge and purpose in Port Fathom. His official role was that of confessor. He was the one who would listen to the girls' sins, who would identify the nature of their spiritual sickness. But his true, unspoken duty was that of the disposer of remains. He oversaw the convent's small, windswept cemetery and the crematorium. He was the one who ensured that the earthen vessels, once purified, returned to ash and dust, their stories turning to smoke on the Oregon wind. Their initial modus operandi was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. A new novice, isolated from her family and the outside world, would be subjected to weeks of sleep deprivation, fasting, and intense circular theological debates with Mother Superior Fairfax. Her spirit would be systematically broken down, her sense of self eroded until she was consumed by guilt and fear. She would be convinced that her very soul was in peril, that a sickness was growing within her chest. In the final stages, she would be led to Father Crowe for a final, terrifying confession. He would pronounce her spiritual disease incurable by prayer alone. He would prescribe the final solace, the physical purification. The only way to save her eternal soul, she was told, was to offer up the corrupted organ that housed her sin, to give her heart literally to God. Desperate, terrified, and brainwashed, many of the girls are believed to have walked to Sister Agnes's infirmary willingly, believing they were martyrs approaching their salvation. For the first decade, the operation was small, precise, perhaps 1 or 2 novices a year. But as the convent's reputation grew, so did its enrollment, and so did the trio's ambition. The Fairfax Doctrine evolved. It was no longer enough to simply destroy the diseased organs. Mother Superior Fairfax, in her profound theological narcissism, decided they must be preserved. They were trophies. They were specimens for study. They were proof of her divine work. This is when the true nature of the crime escalated from simple murder to something far more grotesque, ritual murder and anatomical collection. Sister Agnes, whose skills apparently went far beyond those of a simple infirmarian, developed a sophisticated method of preservation. After the purification, the heart would be taken to a hidden laboratory deep in the convent's foundation. There, it would be treated, preserved in a chemical solution, and sealed within a heavy, lead-soldered preservation tin, the kind used for expensive teas or tobaccos. And on each tin, a small lead tag was affixed, hand-stamped with a single word: vanity, deceit, sedition, despair, pride, doubt. It was a library of excised sin, a collection of anatomical blasphemies. The disappearances became more frequent. The donations from wealthy, grateful families swelled the convent's coffers. The operation, running for 34 years, became a well-oiled machine of spiritual and physical destruction. The screams of the victims were absorbed by the thick stone walls. The smoke from the crematorium was dismissed by the townspeople as fog rolling in from the sea. Father Crowe's cemetery grew, but the graves, if anyone had dared to check, were filled with nothing but ash and rocks. The real evidence, the true remains, were being catalogued and stored in a plaza no one was ever meant to find. Absolute control, however, cannot last forever. In the winter of 1956, a young novice named Sister Agnes O'Connor, a cruel irony that she shared a name with the convent's surgeon, began to see the cracks in the facade of Perpetual Solace. Unlike the other girls, Agnes had not been sent for a specific moral failing. She was an orphan, devout and intelligent, who had come to the convent seeking a genuine connection with God. Her clarity had not yet been eroded by Fairfax's psychological warfare. She noticed things, the way certain girls, always the most vibrant and questioning ones, would be selected for private study with the Mother Superior and never be seen again. She heard whispers, sounds late at night from the infirmary wing that did not sound like prayer. She saw Father Crow digging graves at odd hours, graves that seemed too shallow, too perfunctory. Most chillingly, she found a small discarded lead tag near the crematorium. On it was a single stamped word, curiosity. Agnes O'Connor began to keep a secret journal, writing in a coded shorthand she had developed as a child. She documented the dates girls went missing, the strange deliveries of chemicals to Sister Agnes's infirmary, the unsettling theological sermons of Mother Superior Fairfax. She knew she was in mortal danger. She understood, with a dawning, bone-deep terror, that this was not a house of God. It was a slaughterhouse for souls. Her journal was a ticking bomb, a testament against the unholy trinity of Port Fathom. She had to find a way to get it out. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of Port Fathom, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. A single drop of doubt in an ocean of dogma. That is all it takes to challenge an empire built on lies. For 34 years, Mother Superior Eleanor Fairfax's empire of faith and flesh was absolute. But in the final months of 1956, inside the cold stone walls of the Convent of Perpetual Solace, that drop of doubt had a name, Sister Agnes O'Connor. She held the truth in a secret journal, a truth she knew would be her death sentence if it were ever discovered. The question was not whether they would find her out, but whether she could get the story out first. Sister Agnes O'Connor was not a fool. She knew she could not simply walk out of the gates. She was a prisoner, as surely as any inmate in a federal penitentiary. Her plan was desperate, and it relied on a single fragile thread of trust. Once a month, a lay worker from Port Fathom, a quiet woman named Mary, would come to collect charity donations, old books and mended clothes, for the town library. Agnes had befriended her, sensing in Mary a simple kindness that was utterly absent within the convent walls. Over several weeks, Agnes O'Connor painstakingly transcribed the most damning parts of her journey into thin sheets of onion skin paper. The names of the missing girls, the dates of their private study, her suspicions about the infirmary and the crematorium. She sealed the papers inside the hollowed-out spine of a thick book of psalms. Her hope was that Mary would deliver it to the town's chief librarian, a man known for his inquisitive nature, who might ask the questions no one else dared. As a final desperate measure, she took the original journal, wrapped it in oilcloth, and sealed it inside a small tin box. Late one moonless night, she snuck out to the convent's blighted vegetable garden, a patch of earth rarely tended, and buried the box deep beneath a loose stone at the base of the garden wall. If she failed, if she was discovered, maybe, just maybe, someone, someday, would find this last testament. The day of the exchange arrived. The book was passed. For a single, fleeting moment, Agnes felt a surge of hope. But she had made a fatal miscalculation. She had underestimated the totality of Mother Superior Fairfax's control. The kind, simple lay worker, Mary, was not just a helper. She was an informant. For a few extra dollars a month, she reported on any unusual behavior, any whispers of dissent. The trust Agnes had placed in her was a mirage. Mary delivered the book, not to the librarian, but directly into the hands of Mother Superior Fairfax. The confrontation was not immediate. Fairfax was a connoisseur of psychological torment. She let Agnes live with her false hope for 3 days. 3 days of watching the gates, praying for a sign of salvation. Then she was summoned, not to the infirmary, not to the chapel, but to Mother Superior's private study, a grand, cold room, lined with theological texts, its air thick with the smell of old paper and beeswax. There was no shouting, no accusations. Mother Superior Fairfax's method was far more chilling. She looked at Agnes with a gaze that mingled disappointment and a kind of clinical curiosity, as if observing a fascinating new bacterium under a microscope. "Sister Agnes," she began, her voice a low, melodic hum, "we have been so proud of your devotion. Your heart, we believed, was pure, but it seems a sickness has taken root, a spiritual malady I have seen before. It is called presumption. The sin of believing your small, mortal truth is more significant than God's divine order." She gestured to the pages. "You have documented what you cannot possibly understand. You see procedures and mistake them for crimes. You see salvation and call it murder. You have mistaken the surgeon's scalpel for the butcher's knife. Tell me, child, when we exorcise a cancerous tumor from the body to save a life, do we weep for the tumor?" Agnes O'Connor, her blood running cold, refused to break. She stood straight and met Mother Superior's gaze. "You are not exorcising tumors," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You are murdering girls. You are stealing their lives and hiding behind a veil of faith." A slow, thin smile touched Eleanor Fairfax's lips. It was the most terrifying expression Agnes had ever seen. "So the sickness is advanced," she said softly. "The corruption has reached the seat of reason. The diagnosis is clear. The treatment, therefore, is necessary." She stood up and walked to a small silver bell on her desk. As she rang it, the study door opened. Sister Agnes, the surgeon, and Father Michael Crow entered, their faces as placid and emotionless as stone. They flanked the doorway, blocking any chance of escape. "Your final diagnosis, Sister Agnes O'Connor," Mother Superior Fairfax pronounced, her voice resonating with absolute authority, "is righteousness, a fatal pride. It is the most stubborn of the spiritual cancers, but our work is to provide solace, and you, my dear child, will be granted it." Agnes O'Connor became the 73rd and final victim of the Fairfax Doctrine. Her heart, preserved in a tin and labeled with her sin, would join the others in the dark archive beneath the chapel. The system, perfected over 34 years, closed ranks seamlessly. Father Crow's crematorium burned hot that night. The convent's records were updated to show that Sister Agnes O'Connor had been granted a special transfer to a silent mission in rural Quebec, a story her distant, uninterested relatives accepted without question. Mother Superior Fairfax, Sister Agnes, and Father Crow had committed the perfect series of crimes. They had created a self-sustaining, profitable institution of murder, protected by wealth, religious authority, and the willful ignorance of the outside world. The secret seemed buried forever, along with the small tin box in the convent garden, but they had failed to account for one power greater than their own. Not God, but nature itself. In the autumn of 1957, a year after the murder of Sister Agnes O'Connor, and months after the convent had been quietly shuttered and abandoned by its architects who had vanished with their fortune, the coast of Oregon was battered by one of the most violent storms in its history. The wind and rain were relentless. The sea, whipped into a fury, surged higher than ever recorded. The cliffside on which the Convent of Perpetual Solace stood began to give way. The foundations, expertly laid, but no match for the geologic rage of the storm, cracked. Water, Tons and tons of it poured into the convent's lower levels. It flooded the kitchens, the laundry, and the labyrinthine root cellars, and in doing so, it broke the seal on a hidden, bricked-up doorway, a doorway that was never on any of the building's blueprints, a doorway that led to Mother Superior Fairfax's Library of Sin. Weeks later, when the waters receded, state officials arrived. Their job was mundane: to enter the condemned structure and assess whether it was a public hazard. They carried clipboards and flashlights, expecting to find rot and structural damage. They walked through the mud-caked, silent halls, their boots echoing in the oppressive quiet. It was in the basement, while tracing the source of the flood damage, that a surveyor noticed it: the fresh breach in the cellar wall, a dark opening smelling of stagnant water, chemicals, and something else, something indescribably foul. He aimed his flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the gloom, glinting off something on the shelves that lined the hidden chamber. It wasn't jars of preserves. It wasn't wine. It was a neat, orderly collection of metal tins, rows upon rows of them. And as he stepped inside, the beam fell upon one of the small, stamped tags. Despair. What is the weight of a human heart? Medically, it is about 300 grams, but in the flooded cellars of the Convent of Perpetual Solace, its weight was measured in years of silence, in fortunes paid for complicity, and in the sheer, unimaginable audacity of evil posing as divinity. The state surveyor who stumbled into that hidden chamber did not know what he had found. He only knew it felt profoundly, fundamentally wrong. He backed out of the dark, brick-lined room, his flashlight beam trembling, and made a call not to his superiors at the Department of Public Works, but to the state police. The investigation into the Convent of Perpetual Solace had begun. The man tasked with leading the investigation was State Police Detective Miles Corbin. Corbin was a veteran of the Second World War, a man who had seen the horrors of Omaha Beach. He was methodical, pragmatic, and had little patience for hysterics or superstition. He believed in evidence, in facts, in the cold, hard logic of a crime scene, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what lay waiting in Port Fathom. Corbin and his team documented the scene with a chilling precision that mirrored the crime itself. The discovery location was officially designated a tomb. The key discovery was the collection of tins. There were 73 of them in total. Each one was carefully removed, labeled as evidence, and transported to the state medical examiner's office. The state coroner, Dr. Alistair Finch, later described the experience in a sworn deposition. The preservation technique was immaculate, he stated, his voice heavy with a kind of horrified awe. Far beyond what one would expect from an amateur. The organ tissues were largely intact. It was expert work. Inside each tin, floating in a murky formaldehyde-based solution, was a single human heart. And with each heart was its corresponding metal tag, its diagnosis of sin. The investigators laid the tags out in rows on a cold, steel table. It was a lexicon of human imperfection, a catalogue of reasons for murder: pride, ambition, vanity, deceit, curiosity, doubt, melancholy, passion, sedition, and, of course, the final tag, presumed to belong to their most recent victim, righteousness. 73 hearts, 73 sins, 73 vanished women. The scale of the atrocity was beginning to take shape. With the physical evidence secured, Detective Corbin turned his attention to the convent's records. He needed to put names to the victims. On the surface, the paperwork was impeccable. Mother Superior Fairfax had been a meticulous administrator. Corbin's team found ledgers detailing every donation, every expense, and they found the files for every novice who had ever entered the convent. But the files were a masterwork of deception. Of the 73 victims they now knew existed, the files told a different story. Dozens were listed as having taken final vows and entered a permanent cloister, their files stamped "Eternal Devotion, all secular ties severed." Others were marked as transferred to missions in Quebec, in South America, in Europe. A few were even recorded as having died from common illnesses, tuberculosis, influenza. Their remains noted as cremated on site by Father Michael Crow, with death certificates signed by Sister Agnes, the convent's supposed physician. It was a perfect, self-contained system of lies. Every disappearance was accounted for. Every loose end was tied. The families had been placated with eloquent letters, the authorities with official-looking documents. The convent had created its own reality, and for 34 years the world had believed it. For Detective Corbin, it was a frustrating dead end. He had 73 victims with no bodies, a litany of sins, and a paper trail that led nowhere. The perpetrators, Fairfax, Agnes, and Crow, were named in a ledger, but they had vanished without a trace months before the storm, leaving behind a legacy of perfect, impenetrable evil. Frustrated, Corbin returned to the convent grounds. He felt he was missing something. He walked the perimeter, trying to see the place not as a crime scene, but as the prison it had been. He stood in the overgrown vegetable garden, the gray Oregon sky pressing down on him. He kicked at the damp soil, his mind racing. He was a man who believed in evidence, and the evidence was telling him an impossible story. And that's when he saw it, a single gray flagstone at the base of the outer wall that was slightly askew. It was almost nothing, a detail most would overlook. But Corbin, trained to see the flaws in the landscape, the single thread that is out of place, felt a prickle of instinct. He wedged his fingers under the stone and lifted. It came away easily. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, damp earth, was a small, rusted tin box. It was the journal of Sister Agnes O'Connor. The brittle pages, filled with a coded, frantic script, were a Rosetta Stone for the entire conspiracy. Over days, with the help of a cryptographer, Corbin's team translated the last, desperate testimony of the convent's 73rd victim. She had documented it all, the names of the girls. The dates were taken for purification. She described the Fairfax Doctrine in horrifying detail, quoting the Mother Superior's sermons on the physical nature of sin. She named the Unholy Trinity, Mother Superior Eleanor Fairfax, the theologian, Sister Agnes, the surgeon, Father Michael Crow, the confessor and disposer. The journal was the voice of the victims, reaching out from beyond the grave. It was the narrative that tied the disembodied hearts in the cellar to the real, breathing young women who had been systematically tormented and murdered. It described the psychological torture, the mock trials, the final, terrifying walk to the infirmary. It was the complete blueprint of a factory of death. And in its final entry, dated the day before her own murder, Agnes O'Connor had written a single, uncoded sentence. She says, "My sin is righteousness. I believe it is my only salvation. They are coming for me now. Forgive them, for they know exactly what they do." Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of Port Fathom, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. We now have the crime, the method, and the names of the perpetrators. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. The journal of Sister Agnes O'Connor was more than a confession. It was an indictment. It transformed the bizarre discovery in Port Fathom from a macabre local mystery into a national manhunt. The names Fairfax, Agnes, and Crow were no longer just specters in a dead girl's diary. They were fugitives, the unholy trinity of the Convent of Perpetual Solace, who had perfected the art of making others disappear, had now vanished themselves. Detective Miles Corbin had the story. He had the evidence, but his perpetrators were ghosts in the wind. The search for the trio became an obsession for Corbin. He dispatched bulletins across the country and, through Interpol, to international authorities. The story, leaked to the press, exploded into a national sensation, a gothic horror story that captivated and repulsed the public in equal measure. Newspapers dubbed Mother Superior Fairfax the Abbess of Atrocity and Sister Agnes the Angel of Anguish. The crime was so baroque, so alien to the buttoned-down sensibilities of 1950s America that it felt like fiction. But the investigation hit a wall of money and influence. Corbin's team began the painstaking process of contacting the families of the 73 victims identified from Agnes O'Connor's journal. They expected grief, shock, outrage. Instead, what they encountered was a coordinated, chilling silence. These were the wealthiest, most powerful families in the Pacific Northwest: timber barons, shipping magnates, politicians. The convent had not been their shame. It had been their solution. To admit that their daughters had been murdered was to admit that they had paid a monster to dispose of their inconvenient children. It was a scandal that would ruin dynasties, shatter reputations. And so they closed ranks. Lawyers were called, threats were made, official inquiries were stonewalled. The families claimed their daughters were alive and well in distant missions, producing old, forged letters from the convent as proof. They painted the investigation as a sensationalist witch hunt, an attack on their privacy and their faith. They chose to believe the comforting lie over the devastating truth. They had paid for silence once, and they were determined to maintain it. This wall of silence gave the fugitives a critical head start. Financial records showed that Mother Superior Fairfax had been as meticulous in her escape plan as she had been in her crimes. Over the years, she had systematically transferred the convent's donations, a fortune amounting to millions in today's currency, to a series of anonymous numbered bank accounts in Switzerland. The paper trail went cold in Zurich. It seemed the trio had purchased their immunity, melting away into the opulent obscurity of post-war Europe. For 2 years, the case stalled. The tins of hearts remained in an evidence vault, a silent testament to a crime without a conviction. The world began to forget, but Detective Corbin did not. The break came not from a police bulletin or a financial trace, but from a place of profound guilt. Father Michael Crow, the confessor, the disposer of remains, had always been the weak link in the Trinity. Fairfax was the true believer, the architect of the doctrine. Sister Agnes was the cold, detached practitioner. But Crow was just a man, a fallen priest haunted by the ghosts of the girls whose last confessions he had heard, whose bodies he had turned to ash. In 1959, nearly 2 years after the discovery, a letter arrived at the Vatican from a parish priest in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The priest wrote of a troubled man in his congregation, an American expatriate living under the name Roberto Sanchez, who was drinking himself to death. This man was tormented by nightmares and would frequently appear at the church, rambling incoherently in confession about a clinic of the soul on a cliff by the sea, about a library of sins, and about an angel with a scalpel. The details were too specific, too bizarre to be the product of a drunken mind. The Vatican, aware of the Port Fathom scandal, quietly forwarded the letter to Interpol, who passed it to a persistent detective in Oregon. Corbin flew to Buenos Aires immediately. He found Roberto Sanchez in a derelict apartment, surrounded by empty bottles. The man who had once been the imposing, authoritative Father Crow was now a withered, trembling wreck. The confession came flooding out. He told Corbin everything. He detailed the hierarchy, the rituals, the financial arrangements. He confirmed every last detail of Agnes O'Connor's journal. He told Corbin that after fleeing the States, the three had settled in Argentina. But their unholy alliance, held together by shared guilt and mutual dependence, had begun to fracture. Mother Superior Fairfax, now living as a wealthy widow under the name Elena Franco, had remained as cold and certain as ever. She viewed their escape not as a reprieve, but as a validation of her superiority. She had begun to talk of founding a new institute in South America. Sister Agnes, using the name Anna, had seemingly vanished, taking her share of the money and disappearing even from their small circle. Crow, consumed by his guilt, was left to rot. He gave Corbin the one piece of information he needed most, the address of Eleanor Fairfax's secluded villa in the Andean foothills outside the city. The confrontation was not a dramatic raid. It was quiet, tense, and deeply unsettling. Corbin, accompanied by 2 Argentine policemen, arrived at a beautiful, sun-drenched villa surrounded by a high wall and immaculate gardens. It was a world away from the damp, gray misery of Port Fathom. A servant led them to a patio where a woman was sitting reading a book. She looked up, and even in her old age, her eyes were unmistakable. They were the cold, intelligent, utterly unfearing eyes of Mother Superior Eleanor Fairfax. She looked at Corbin, then at the police, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. The same smile that must have terrified Agnes O'Connor. "Detective Corbin, I presume," she said, her English perfect and unaccented. "I must confess, I am surprised it took you so long." She showed no remorse, no denial. She spoke of her work at the convent with a chilling, academic pride, as if discussing a successful research project. "You see it as murder," she told Corbin, her voice calm and condescending. "A brutish, simple word for a complex, necessary process. I did not take lives, detective. I harvested souls at their moment of perfect contrition. I gave those girls an eternity they could never have achieved with the sickness festering in their hearts. You found my library. Did you not see the beauty in it? The order, the sheer theological elegance. You are a man who looks at a cathedral and sees only a pile of stones." She truly believed it. In her mind, she was not a murderer, she was a pioneer. She was not a fugitive. She was an exile, misunderstood by a lesser, unenlightened world. Her lack of remorse was perhaps the most monstrous thing about her. She was a woman for whom evil was not a transgression, but a philosophy. She was arrested without incident, her composure never breaking, her belief in her own righteousness absolute and unshakable. The arrest of Mother Superior Eleanor Fairfax and the confession of Father Michael Crow ignited a legal firestorm. The trial of the century, as the papers called it, was set to begin in Oregon. It promised to be a public exorcism, a moment for the state to confront the darkness that had festered in its midst for 34 years. The public wanted a reckoning. They wanted to see the monsters unmasked and punished. They wanted a simple story of good versus evil. But the legacy of the Convent of Perpetual Solace was anything but simple, and the trial would prove to be as much about the secrets of the living as the sins of the dead. Eleanor Fairfax was extradited from Argentina to stand trial. Father Crow, broken and ailing, agreed to turn state's evidence in exchange for a lesser sentence. The third perpetrator, the surgeon's Sister Agnes, remained a ghost. Despite a global manhunt, she was never found. Some investigators believed she had used her surgical skills to alter her own appearance. Others suspected Fairfax, seeing her as a future liability, had arranged for her permanent disappearance. Whatever the truth, the angel of anguish vanished from history, leaving only her 2 collaborators to face the consequences. The trial, held in Portland in 1960, was a media circus. The prosecution, led by a determined district attorney, laid out the case with methodical precision. They presented the 73 preserved hearts as evidence, a horrifying, silent jury staring out from glass jars. They read from the translated journal of Sister Agnes O'Connor, her words echoing through the shocked courtroom. They put Father Crow on the stand, who, in a trembling, tear-filled testimony, corroborated every detail of the systematic murder, his confession painting a hellish portrait of the convent's inner workings. The prosecution's case seemed overwhelming, irrefutable, but they hadn't counted on Eleanor Fairfax. She did not act like a defendant on trial for her life. She acted like a visiting professor delivering a lecture. Representing herself with chilling composure and intellect, she turned the trial into a theological debate. She did not deny the purifications. She embraced them. She cross-examined Father Crowe not as a witness to a crime, but as a failed student who had lost his faith. She spoke directly to the jury, her voice calm and authoritative, weaving complex arguments from scripture and obscure philosophy. She argued that she was not beholden to the laws of man, but to a higher, divine law. "You call them victims," she declared in her closing argument, her eyes sweeping across the stunned courtroom. "I call them saints. Each one offered their flawed, earthly heart to achieve a state of perfect grace, a sacrifice you, in your secular, mundane world, cannot comprehend. You seek to punish me for my faith, for my success. But history will not judge me by your laws. It will judge me by my results. I created 73 saints. What, gentlemen of the jury, have you ever created?" Her performance was so bizarre, so audacious, that it sowed confusion. Her defense was, in essence, insanity. But she was so lucid, so intelligent, that she defied the legal definition. She was a woman operating on a completely different moral plane, a place where murder was a sacrament. The jury was sequestered for 9 days. The nation held its breath. When they returned, the verdict was a messy compromise that satisfied no one. Father Michael Crowe, for his cooperation, was found guilty of 73 counts of accessory to murder and sentenced to life in prison, though he would die of cirrhosis less than 2 years into his sentence. Eleanor Fairfax was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict was a legal maneuver to prevent a charismatic, unrepentant murderer from becoming a martyr, or, worse, potentially being acquitted by a bewildered jury. She would not go to prison, but she would be committed to the Oregon State Hospital for the criminally insane for the remainder of her life. For the public, it was a hollow victory. There was no catharsis, no clear condemnation. The monster had been caged, but she had never been forced to admit she was a monster. Eleanor Fairfax lived for another 17 years in the state hospital. She never wavered from her beliefs. She spent her days writing a sprawling, 1,000-page theological treatise justifying her life's work, a document the state has kept sealed. She treated the doctors and guards with the same condescending superiority she had shown the court, viewing them as her intellectual inferiors. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1977, unrepentant to the very end. The fate of the victims' families was a quieter, more insidious unraveling. The trial had ripped away their veil of secrecy. In the aftermath, several of the powerful dynasties crumbled under the weight of the public scandal. There were divorces, suicides, hostile takeovers of family businesses. The shame they had paid so much to avoid came back to consume them. Their complicity had a price, and it was paid out over a generation. They had tried to bury their daughters, and in the end, the scandal buried them. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of Port Fathom, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. The trial was over, the perpetrators dealt with. But what became of the convent? And what of the hearts? Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. The Convent of Perpetual Solace was never torn down. It was deemed a hazardous site and simply abandoned, a permanent scar on the Oregon coast. It became a place of dark pilgrimage for teenagers and ghost hunters, a local legend whispered around campfires. The building itself became a monument to the evil it had contained, slowly surrendering to the relentless wind and rain of the Pacific. The final, unsettling question was what to do with the evidence. What to do with 73 human hearts in jars. They could not be returned to families who had, for the most part, disowned them even in death. They could not be buried, as they were not whole bodies. For decades, they remained in an evidence vault, a collection of anatomical ghosts in legal limbo. The story was over, but the final physical proof of the crime endured, an unquiet archive waiting for a final chapter. Time is not a healer, it is a solvent. It dissolves facts into legends, turns crime scenes into tourist traps, and allows the comfortable to forget the sins of their fathers. For decades after the trial, this is what happened to the story of the Convent of Perpetual Solace. The perpetrators were gone. The powerful families who enabled them had paid their price in scandal and ruin. The convent itself was a skeleton on the cliff, a place for ghost stories. And in a climate-controlled evidence vault in the state capital, the 73 hearts of its victims remained, a bureaucratic problem with no solution. They were evidence in a closed case, artifacts of a horror everyone wanted to forget. But some stories refuse to be forgotten. They choose their own keepers. In the early 2000s, nearly half a century after the discovery, the story chose Dr. Evelyn Reed. Reed was a historical archivist at the University of Oregon, a woman with a professional and personal obsession with the state's hidden histories. She was not a detective or a ghost hunter. She was a scholar of memory, and she believed that to shelve the story of the Fairfax victims was to commit a final, unforgivable crime against them. She first encountered the case as a footnote in a study of Oregon's legal history. It was a brief, sensationalized paragraph about the heart-snatching nuns. But for Reed, the footnote was a doorway. She began digging. She spent years petitioning the state under the Freedom of Information Act, slowly prying away the sealed court documents, the police reports, the coroner's notes, and the crime scene photographs. She became the world's foremost expert on a horror no one else wanted to study. Dr. Reed's research led her to a horrifying realization. The 73 hearts, known officially as State's Evidence Item Number 1138, were still in custody. They were not considered human remains in a legal sense. They were, in the cold language of the law, biological material pertaining to an adjudicated felony. They had no rights. They could not be buried. They were destined to sit on a shelf in a vault until they degraded into nothing. For Evelyn Reed, this was an obscenity. These were not items. They were young women. They were Amelia, Clara, Sarah. 73 names she had meticulously recovered from Agnes O'Connor's journal. They deserved a grave. They deserved a name. They deserved peace. Thus began Evelyn Reed's second great battle. Her first had been to uncover the truth. Her second was to fight the colossal indifference of the state bureaucracy to see it honored. She filed petitions. She wrote letters. She lobbied state senators. She argued that these were not just hearts. They were the only remains of the victims whose bodies had been turned to ash and scattered by Father Crow. To deny them a burial was to deny their very existence. The state pushed back. It was too complicated, they said, too expensive. There was no legal precedent. Who had the right to claim them? Most of the families were long gone or still refused to acknowledge their connection. Reopening the case, even for a burial, would stir up a history the state was happy to leave buried. But Reed was relentless, and she had an ace up her sleeve. In her research, she had discovered the existence of Mother Superior Fairfax's asylum writings, the 1,000-page manifesto that had been sealed upon her death. Reed argued in court that to understand the full scope of the crime, and thus the full humanity of the victims, the state must unseal the mind of their killer. After a 2-year legal battle, a judge agreed. Dr. Evelyn Reed was granted exclusive access to the last words of the Abbess of Atrocity. What she found in those pages was not the rambling of a madwoman. It was a document of pure, distilled philosophical evil. Fairfax did not rave. She theorized. She laid out her doctrine in chillingly lucid prose, arguing for the necessity of her work. The Fairfax family said that the modern world coddles sin. It treats the soul as a democracy where every flawed impulse is given a vote. This is a fatal error. The soul is a monarchy, and its only legitimate ruler is God. Any competing impulse, pride, desire, doubt, is an act of sedition, an insurrection, and the duty of a monarch, the duty of God's servant, is to crush insurrection without mercy. The Fairfax family said, "They called my infirmary a place of death. How pedestrian! It was a place of purification, a crucible. Death is merely the cessation of breath. What I offered was a transfiguration, the liberation of the eternal spirit from its prison of flawed, mortal meat. The hearts I collected were not trophies. They were the discarded cages. I was not a killer, Doctor. I was a liberator." Armed with this definitive proof of Fairfax's calculated philosophical malice, proving her crimes were not a fit of passion, but a deliberate, intellectual process, Reed made her final push. She published excerpts in an influential historical journal. The public revulsion was palpable and immediate. The state, facing a new wave of public pressure, finally buckled. In 2008, more than 50 years after their discovery, the state of Oregon released the 73 hearts into the custody of Dr. Evelyn Reed for the sole purpose of a final, dignified burial. Evelyn Reed had won. She had fought the silence, she had fought the bureaucracy, and she had stared into the mind of the monster and not blinked. She had finally given the victims a voice. Now she had to give them a resting place. The script is not yet complete. I will continue with the final part, Part 7, in the next response. The liturgy finds its conclusion, not in fire or judgment, but in the quiet dignity of a long-overdue farewell. This is the final chapter. A story does not truly end until its victims are granted a name and a place. For 51 years, the victims of the Convent of Perpetual Solace were neither. They were evidence. They were a mystery. They were a collection of horrors stored in a vault. In the spring of 2008, they finally came home, not to the cursed ground of the convent, but to a small public cemetery in Port Fathom, a place of quiet reflection overlooking the same sea that had borne witness to their silent suffering. The funeral was not a media spectacle. It was a small, somber affair, orchestrated by Dr. Evelyn Reed. The single casket, containing the sealed containers of the 73 hearts, was lowered into the earth. There were no grieving family members wailing at the graveside. The legacy of shame and silence from those powerful dynasties was too deep. The attendees were few but significant. Dr. Reed herself, the keeper of their memory, a handful of aging townspeople representing the community's collective, long unspoken guilt, and a few great-nieces and nephews of the victims, a younger generation who had broken with their family's code of silence to finally honor their lost kin. A local priest, a man who had not even been born when the convent closed, offered a simple prayer. He did not speak of sin or purification. He spoke of innocence lost, of trust betrayed, and of the profound duty of the living to remember the dead. For the first time, the names of the 73 women were read aloud, each name echoing in the salty air, a roll call of the stolen. It was a quiet, heartbreaking, and necessary end. The final physical act of the Fairfax Doctrine was, at last, undone. But a burial is for the dead. A memorial is for the living. Dr. Reed ensured that their final resting place would not be an unmarked grave. She used funds raised by a historical society to erect a monument. And on that stone, she performed one last powerful act of defiance against the legacy of Mother Superior Fairfax. In memory of the 73 daughters of the Convent of Perpetual Solace, 1923, 1957, they were judged for their humanity. May we remember them for it. To see the list is to understand the true nature of the Fairfax crime. She did not punish sin, she punished character. She murdered the inquisitive, the passionate, the sad, the defiant. She murdered every quality that makes a human being an individual. The memorial turns her weapon back on itself, transforming her condemnations into badges of honor. It stands today as a permanent record, ensuring that no one will ever forget not only that they died, but why they were killed. In the years that followed, the final loose ends were tied. The ruins of the Convent of Perpetual Solace, deemed a public hazard and a site of profound moral stain, were demolished in 2011. The ground was leveled, and the cliffside was allowed to return to its natural state. There is nothing left there now but wind and rock. Sister Agnes O'Connor's journal and Mother Superior, Fairfax's Asylum Manifesto, are now stored in the Special Collections Archive at the University of Oregon, accessible to scholars. A permanent, chilling lesson in the duality of human nature. The story, in all its horror, is now complete. What is the legacy of the Fairfax Doctrine? It is a story that forces us to look at the anatomy of evil itself. It teaches us that the greatest horrors are not always born of chaos and madness, but sometimes of order, intellect, and an absolute certainty of one's own righteousness. Mother Superior Eleanor Fairfax was not a raving lunatic. She was a philosopher of murder, a CEO of cruelty. This story is a testament to the terrifying power of institutional betrayal. The convent was meant to be a place of safety, the church a source of comfort, the families a bastion of love. All three failed. The convent became a laboratory, the church a co-conspirator, and the families willing customers in the disposal of their own children. It is a chilling reminder that the walls we build to protect us can just as easily become the walls of a prison, and the people we trust with our souls are sometimes the very ones who seek to collect them. But if there is a sliver of light in this abyss, it is in the endurance of truth, in the courage of Sister Agnes O'Connor, who wrote it down, in the diligence of Detective Miles Corbin, who hunted it down, and in the persistence of Dr. Evelyn Reed, who refused to let it be forgotten. They prove that memory is an active battle, and that the first duty of the living is to fight against the silence that the powerful so often demand. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that in our modern world, we still place too much blind faith in the walls of institutions and the words of those in power? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told.